Yo, Yu Yu Hakusho. At the start of this year, I made a random arbitrary goal of reading as many books as I can, just to kind of see how I would do. And I downloaded an app and I started tracking all the books I was reading. Today, I am excited to share with you a comprehensive roundup of all of the books that I read during my spring semester in my master's program, as well as the books that I guess I read this winter. Overall, I'm going to keep things spoiler free just because I want you guys to potentially read any of these if they interest you, or maybe they get turned into a movie or a TV show, and then you can watch them and not know what's going to happen. But I will allude to some spoilers, but they'll be out of context, so you'll only get it if you get the context. But overall, we're going to be spoiler free. I hope this video is interesting. I understand that you guys are all here for my riveting vlogs. But I thought that it'd be a little fun to do something that's a little bit more closely connected to what I've been doing on a day-to-day. I also know that the amount of books that I've read isn't earth-shattering. Within 4 months, I read 24 books, which sounds like it could be a lot, but I know plenty of people who've read 80 or 100 by now, or 40. And so it's not earth-shattering, but it was a little dent. I'm proud of my little dent. Give me that. Also, considering that I'm working full-time as a master's student and I tutor on the side, I think I deserve some slack. Oh, just as a general rule, I have to round up all of the ratings on my graphic because I'm not really into graphic design. I don't want to really do the hassle of having to do 0.5s and 0.75, so all of the ratings you see will be rounded up. But yeah, let's get right into it. The first book I read this year is The Shadow of Death by T.J. Schmidt. It was a reread for me because I'd already read the physical copy when it was prior to being published. I was one of the editors, but the audiobook allowed me to re-experience the story in a slightly unique way. Dad and I listened to this audiobook while we were road tripping and I was moving up here. The book's premise is that we have 3 kids, a brother, a sister, and their friend. And all of their lives drastically change because of the events that happen as a side effect of the war taking over the world of Aya. The 3 of them join an organization called the Order of the Light, which their entire purpose is to protect people from the darkness and also, and vice versa, protect the darkness from people. So the story is a young adult fantasy that explores the themes of human nature and the juxtaposition of good versus evil. One major difference that I felt when I was listening to the audiobook is that it felt like everything took a lot longer, which of course is because I read decently fast when I'm reading books physically, and so having my pace kind of monitored was a little challenging. This is technically the first audiobook I've ever finished, but the second audiobook that I've started. One aspect of the audiobook specifically that I really enjoyed was the description of the darkness's voice. That was actually voiced by T.J. Schmidt, or Timothy, as we know, himself. And it was really, really well done because the way that I envisioned the darkness sounding when I read it was nowhere near as eerie or as suffocatingly unhuman as it ended up being. So that was something I really enjoyed getting to experience listening to. It was very immersively different from the written format. Overall, I gave it 4 stars. I think it's pretty cool, so check it out if you haven't. The next book on our lineup is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. This is one of the books I did physically bring across state lines with me. This is a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy. So the premise of the Hunger Games is that there are 12 districts and each district sends a boy and a girl representative to the capital to compete in a death game where only one victor survives and they bring honor to their tribe or their district. And they've been doing this for decades at the point of the Hunger Games. This book is the prequel to that. So this is the precursor. This is the, not necessarily origin story, but this is the life of the villain of those books, Coriolanus Snow, when he was a teenager. So I am a huge Hunger Games fan. I immediately bought this book when it came out. Yeah, I think I immediately bought this book when it came out. I have a first edition. This came out in 2020. I read this in the year 2024, 4 years after I bought it. I know. It sat on my shelf until the movie came out. I went to watch the movie, and then I loved the movie. And so I was like, now I have to read the book. And so here we are. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. I really, really loved it. In comparison between the movie and the book is obviously better. It really explores the relationships and the decline of the protagonist a lot better. As well as in the movie, you kind of have this idea of a good to bad storyline, but in the book, it's gray to black. So I like that. One thing that was really interesting is that all of the conflicts felt a lot more real in the story, like the characters, their dynamics, the way that their relationships were more of a pull and push sort of situation. The development that ended up happening, as well as the lead up to some of the most climactic events, they just felt more like a slow build of tension to those points, which obviously makes sense. Movies have a limited time, books do not. So the movie had to cut a lot of the fat that built to those moments, but whenever you cut out length of time, it does also cut out the amount of tension that is built. The movie kind of felt like a sudden bomb drop, whereas the book felt like a slow erosion. It was still a good movie. I think it's a better book, but it was still a really good movie. However, there's one thing about this book that I still think about pretty regularly, even though I read this book back in January. The motif that snow lands on top is so beautiful because it really just ties the entire story together. Because if you didn't have that motif, the story would feel like a series of not necessarily connected events. Like it wouldn't feel like there was a beginning, an end, and a conclusion without that motif. It's so integral to the story. And I loved it. I loved this. Again, 4.5 stars. I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is an audiobook I started an embarrassingly long time ago. But I'm glad that I finished it before this month, because in this month on Max, the docu-series Quiet on Set came out, and they reference a lot of the things from that book. And I felt like I had a really good understanding of all those moments because I had read the memoir. The premise of this book is it's a memoir of the actress Jeanette McCurdy, who is most famous for her role as Sam Puckett on iCarly. The memoir is basically just her telling her life of basically how she was kind of forced into stardom by her narcissistically abusive mother, and how her mother kind of forced her into this lifestyle she didn't really enjoy because her entire goal in life was to just please her mother. And a lot of things happen. You kind of learn the events of how her mother pressured her into having an eating disorder and basically psychologically and, to some degree physically abused her. And you just kind of learn her life story, leading up to the point where her mom dies of cancer and then following her recovery after the fact. It was a really hard read, but I did think that it was really worth listening to. I gave this book 3.75 stars. A lot of the topics covered in this book were especially heavy, but you felt the rawness and the realness of it because the audiobook that I listened to was read by the author herself, Jeanette McCurdy. One interesting thing that definitely threw me for a loop when I first started the book was that Jeanette McCurdy grew up in Orange County. She grew up and was raised and born in Garden Grove, California. That was hilarious. So they mentioned sometimes going to like the Westminster Mall or like the, just so many random little things nearby that I was just like, wow, I know where that is. I think overall this book was a really interesting experience for me. I've never really expressed personally any interest in reading memoirs, but this book definitely made me want to explore that avenue a bit more because there is a lot of merit and a lot that I learned, especially from the human condition perspective, because I love reading narratives to learn more about people and to learn perspectives and unique situations and everything. So reading from someone's personal experience would definitely be a more unique and raw interpretation of learning more about the human condition. So probably gonna read more memoirs. Haven't yet though. We shall see. So if you haven't noticed by now, my pattern at the beginning when I started reading is I brought 4 fiction books and 4 nonfiction books from home when I moved. And so my plan was to alternate between my plan was to read a fiction book, then a nonfiction book, and vice versa until I ran out of books. And I did. I finished all of them. And so the audiobooks are kind of scattered in there. But so our next book is a nonfiction book. It is Freedom from Sin by John MacArthur. So this is specifically about Romans 6 through 7. This is a Devo. You can't see, but it's a Devo. It's basically just a deep dive into cross-referencing and the understanding of scripture and the varying different ways that people have interpreted Romans over the years, and cross-referencing. John MacArthur is explaining both sides of the argument, then explaining which side he thinks is more valid. Super, super meaty book. This book, meaty. There is not a page, there's not a sentence, there's not a word that is wasted in this book. All of it is purposeful and intentional. The thing is though, because it's really meaty, it was really hard for me to kind of sit and read this quickly and read it in one sitting. Considering it's so small, I could probably finish a book to this size in a day, but this book was so hefty, that wasn't really an option. But at the end of every chapter, there was some questions and they were just questions to help you self-reflect. That really helped me process my thoughts throughout the book because it made it so I felt like I was actually retaining the information I learned rather than just reading through quickly, because you had to sit there and digest, and then you would read a chapter and you would look at it, and then you look at the questions and you'd go back and reread the chapter to answer the questions. I mean, obviously you don't have to do that, but like if you're reading a Devo, why would you not want to learn from it, you know? Again, it's a really meaty Devo, so this is definitely not like entry-level new Christian Devo, but this is like, it was a really good read. I gave it 4.25 stars. So the next book that I read was The Flames of War, which is the first in the Coming Dawn trilogy, and it was written by T.J. Schmidt. So this book is a sequel to The Shadow of Death. This book follows the world of Aya 3 millennia following the conclusion of that story. I did enjoy several of the characters. I even drew fan art of a few. Here's Zev, my favorite, just as reference. Zev specifically felt like a character tailor-made to the preferences I have as a reader. He was very molded to what I like. I'm not going to divulge too much into the events of this story because I don't want to spoil it, but the premise is essentially that we have 2 cousins, Azael and Zev, who live in this small countryside town, and basically they discover that everyone in their town disappeared. And they don't know why. And so the story is an action-adventure kind of mystery following these 2 as they try to discover what happened and then what to do from there. Why did this happen? You know? But there was one specific scene that I have dubbed Hellfire, and if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. You know what Hellfire is. That was very fun. Pure chaos. And for spoiler reasons, I'm not going to say who I'm talking about, but one of the characters' backstories really reminded me of Prince of Persia. That's all I have to say about that. I gave the book 4.5 stars. So, the next book that I read is Percy Jackson and the Olympians' first book, The Lightning Thief. The author is Rick Riordan. Almost forgot. I love Percy Jackson so much. And now I finally get the blue food. I'm so excited that I get the blue food, and I will now always be able to make blue food, and I get why. You have no idea how long that inside joke has bothered me that I didn't get it, but everyone else did. So I listened to this audiobook with my mom when she came to visit, and we had our little trip all around, which is in another vlog. I can explain the premise, but I think that if you don't know the story of Percy Jackson, what are you doing? Anyway, so the premise is that Percy is this really, really weird kid. He cannot focus, he can't read, he has dyslexia, ADHD. He's really struggling. So much so he gets kicked out of almost every school he goes to after being there for a year. And he just is struggling, and he feels bad that he's making his mom live this way. They live in New York City. And his mom and him live with her new husband, who's not his dad. And it's this really abusive man who's very into drinking and gambling and just overall not a good guy. He gets wife beater and son beater titles. And so Percy basically has this sort of like disgruntled view of his actual birth father because he doesn't know anything about him. And he can't like him because he left his mom in these circumstances where she had to remarry this man named Gabe. And so events unfold that make it so Percy's no longer able to stay in school, and he has to go to a special camp because Percy is not fully human. And that's where I shall leave you. If you don't know the story, that's a fun place to end. Genuinely though, it's such a good story. There's so many good adaptations. I obviously like the book the best. But the 2010 movie, I think that's when it came out. That was great. Genuinely really enjoyed it. And Disney recently made a TV show, which I think was less successful, unfortunately, at following the book. Ironically. It's really ironic that the TV show is supposed to be a lot more similar to the book, especially since one of the producers of the TV show was the author Rick Riordan himself. But the movie felt like tonally significantly closer to the book rather than the TV show did. I feel like the story in the movie ended up being more similar to the book than it did the show. I think that the individual plot points technically match beat for beat more with the TV show. But like the overarching theme and meaning of the story, as well as the characterizations and the tone, match the movie a lot better. But again, of course, the book is the best of all of them. But that's kind of what always happens. Very few exceptions. Very few. But again, if you really don't know the actual story of Percy Jackson, watch the 2010 Lightning Thief movie. It's so fun. Mom and I, after we finished reading the book, we watched the movie because Mom had seen the movie, I think, when it came out, but she didn't really remember it. And we had just finished the TV show. Mom, Ari, and I had all finished the TV show. Then Mom and I read the book, and then we watched the movie, and it was such a fun time. We were just Percy Jacksoning. We were just going ham. I genuinely really love this series, and I'm so excited to finally be able to be one of those nerds who can make a Camp Half-Blood shirt and just LARP in it and play Capture the Flag. I'm going to be one of those people. I just have to do it. But yeah, I really love this series. It's actually kind of funny because I started this book when I was in 3rd grade, and I think I got bored. And then I just watched the movie. And then I was like, oh, I like that. And I never went back to read the book. And I don't know why, but I just think that's really funny that that's like lore about me. I gave this book 4 stars. I genuinely love the story of the Lightning Thief, but I've seen it so many times. Like, I've watched the movie a fair few times, and I've watched the TV show, and now I've read the book. And so I've seen it so many times. Like, I feel like to some degree, the enjoyment of the narrative is a little bit less impressive to me because I've seen it so much. But I genuinely love The Lightning Thief as a story, and it was a great book. So the next book that I read was The Oath by Frank Peretti, which was an audiobook recommended to me by Tim. And unfortunately, I did not enjoy this book as much as Tim did. Not that I didn't like the book, I did like it. It just, Tim really, really likes this book. And I've read a lot of Frank Peretti books. I think I've read most of his catalog, to be honest. But this one was not my favorite. The first thing I would like to say is that I think the cover is a mistake, and it gives away the plot, and it should have been marketed as a mystery, and the cover should not be what it is. But whatever. The premise of the book is that the protagonist, Dr. Steve Benson, finds out that his brother and his brother's wife were attacked in the middle of a forest in this one place in the mountains called Hyde Valley. So his brother is found dead and half eaten, and his brother's wife is confused, missing her memories of the night of the incident, but mostly unharmed. And she's found with a knife that's chipped on one end. So the initial thought by Dr. Steve Benson, who is a biologist at the University of Colorado, is that this has to be a bear attack. So him and a couple other guys who are in the area go hunting to try to find which bear killed his brother. And they do an autopsy on the bear that is considered the most likely suspect. And the bear hasn't eaten any people. There's no sign of human remains when they do an autopsy on the bear. And so he feels a little confused by the events, and he continues to investigate the city of Hyde Valley. And he meets a cop, and everyone is trying to tell him, you shouldn't trust this place. This place is shady. No one's going to tell you the truth because you're an outsider. So he's like, huh. So then he stays to investigate. And the story is his investigation to understand what is the secret to this city and how does it relate to the death of his brother. Overall, my favorite character is Levi Cobb. He's great. We like him a lot, but unfortunately, I think his existence in this story is a mistake. I like him. I think the story would be better if he didn't exist. It's a weird sentence to make, but if you know, you know. I think a lot of the characters were really interesting in concept, but not necessarily in execution. I think a lot of them were intended to be more nuanced than they ended up being, which is a little unfortunate. I really, really liked the ending to the book, and this is like a mild spoiler. Well, it's a spoiler of implication, but it reminded me of Ruhenheim from Monster, which I love Monster. So being compared to Monster is an A+. Overall, I gave the book 3 stars. I think it was fine. I think it should have been more of a mystery. I think some of the characters should have had a little bit more depth, a little bit more complexity to them. Genuinely thought it was fine. The book was a lot longer than I expected it to be, and I feel like considering the length of the book, more tension should have built than did build. That might be a me problem. I might not just be the vibe for this, but I've loved so many other Frank Peretti's works. I don't know. So who knows? So, the next book that I read was a surprise because Mom and I, while she was visiting, we only expected to be able to finish one audiobook, but we loved Percy Jackson, The Lightning Thief, so much that we started Sea of Monsters. Also by Rick Riordan. It's the second in the series, so I'm not going to explain what the premise is because a sequel inherently gives away the ending to the prequel. This book is so significantly different from the movie adaptation, it's insane. Like, it's actually insane. Like, I wouldn't have guessed that that was a movie adaptation of this book because of how different they are. There's like 3 elements that are the same. Three. Not a lot. Another reason why the elements of the story were so different is because in the movie, they cut out a lot of points in The Lightning Thief that weren't inherently important to the story of The Lightning Thief, but are inherently important to the overarching story of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I also cried during the story so much because the beautiful progression of these characters, and they were just so adorable and I loved them. And while I understand the dynamic trio of Annabeth, Grover, and Percy, they're great. I love them too. But Percy and Tyson are so adorable. They are so precious. I loved seeing their journey unfold. They were so adorable. I gave this book 4.2 stars because technically I find it more interesting than The Lightning Thief at where I am in life currently, because I had never seen this story truly unfold before because the movie adaptation was not this story. So yeah, and the season 2 of the TV show hasn't come out yet. There's one specific scene that I think Walter Scobell, who plays Percy Jackson in the TV series on Disney, will do a fantastic job of portraying Percy. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they hired Walter Scobell just for this one scene in Sea of Monsters. I know that's not true. He did fine. But this scene, he would be a lot better of playing Percy than Logan Lerman would be able to. And if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. It's pretty fair. Also, overall, Percy Jackson is some of the best fan art I've ever seen. I love Vivia's art. It's beautiful. I wish I could draw like that. but I can't. I also can barely contain myself from reading the next book because this book ends on a cliffhanger, and I was literally like so stressed. I was like, oh my gosh, Mom, you leave. Like, we're not gonna be able to read this till I go back home. I still haven't read the next book because I've been a good girl. I've been waiting. But the point is, this ended on a cliffhanger, and I want you to know I've been waiting. We finished this book in February. Okay, so this book is the lesser of the Death Note novels. This is Death Note, L Changed the World, written by M. Who are you, M? Is the fact that this is horrible the reason you haven't revealed your identity? Okay, so I started this a while ago, but I don't know when, because it was so mid, I never wanted to pick it up. Premise of this book is extremely interesting. And the premise is also inherently a spoiler to Death Note, so if you haven't seen Death Note, and you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp. The premise is that this is what would happen if L didn't die, and instead of that scene happening, L, to prove that Light was Kira, even though he wasn't writing the names in jail, wrote his own name in the Death Note to prove that you could go 13 days without writing your own name, thus proving Light faked it and he gets imprisoned. So that's what happens before this book starts. And L is now going to die because he wrote that he was going to die in like 30 days to prove that. So that's an interesting premise. If you've ever seen the Death Note live action movies, I think it's the third movie that follows this premise. It's like a little more slow burn slice of life movie. I don't know if I ever finished that movie. And I also know that was the first thing I ever saw of Death Note. I saw part of that movie. I don't think the full movie. Before I ever watched Death Note or read Death Note or anything like that. Premise is interesting. It's based off this. However, the problem is, after that happens, that's it. That's the meat of the story. Everything else is the most boring, generic thing ever. This felt like it was trying to be a spy movie, but they just wanted to market it as Death Note. Because it's after that, Elle's just basically finding out about this secret virus that is like taking over the world secretly, like these doctors constructed. And to be fair, this book was written in 2009 and it felt extremely topical because like COVID and stuff, because like, oh, there's a virus. So yeah, obviously it wasn't written because of COVID. It was written in 2009, but like, it was so boring. The story isn't about any of the stuff about like Elle proving. It would be much more interesting if the story followed when Elle proves that Light is Kira and all of that, and then his like slow whimper into death after that. But no, the story doesn't decide to follow that. It decides to just do a generic action story that felt like a whimper into the void for Elle rather than a triumphant ending. But the art in the book does slap. Like, this cover, spectacular. The back, spectacular. Great art. Great art, doesn't cover up bad writing though. I don't know any of the names of any of the characters in this book that didn't exist in Death Note. I read this book. It's not super long, but I should know the name of I should know the name of anybody. I don't know anyone. I should say, I have a good memory when it comes to names. I don't know anyone. They say their names all the time. It's not like they never talked about it. There's like Dr. K something. Let me reference my notes. Dr. Cujo. See, I knew, but I didn't know because why would I know? This book is just so disappointing. It's just bad. I give it 2 stars. It's not insulting enough to be a 1 star or less than 2 stars. It's just bad. Just 2. Just bad. The next book that I read was one of my favorite books that I think I've ever read in my entire life, and that is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. So I've actually heard amazing things about this book for years, and I knew about it years before I ever started listening to audiobooks. And it was always in my head as like a back burner book I'll get to eventually, but I never really prioritized it. And then I just started listening to it, and then I was like, wow, this is amazing. And there's a specific moment, which I'm not going to spoil, but there's a specific moment in the book where I heard it happen because I listened to the audiobook. And I immediately picked up my phone to text him that he needs to read this book. That's how I felt. I hadn't even finished the book yet. I hadn't even gotten to the main plot of the book. And I was like, Tim, you gotta read. I find the premise of this book pretty hard to explain without spoiling it inherently, but I'll do my best. The story follows Darrow, who is a hell diver in Mars. Basically, Earth is dying and humanity sent some people to go to Mars to basically mine the specific material called helium-3 so that humanity is able to basically survive and eventually make the full jump from all of humanity left on the dying Earth to Mars. And so these people on Mars are the Helldivers and the other miners, are considered heroes. They are pioneers. They are the frontier men for the future. And so Darrow takes a lot of pride in the fact that he's really good at his work. So the helium-3 is kind of the fuel for all the sci-fi stuff in this world. And then the other major aspect of the book is that the book has a caste system. So basically something happened, it's not extremely explained, but something happened in like Earth to basically have an all-out nuclear war or whatever. And so to basically make it so that didn't happen again, humanity's like, we are going to fix this. We're going to make a giant caste system for all of us that we all have to surrender under. And so basically they did a lot of genetic mutation, and they made a caste system, which is in pyramid, which has golds at the top and reds at the bottom. And so the idea is golds are like 7 feet tall. They have gold hair, gold eyes. They're extremely tall. They're the most intelligent. They're the most clever, whatever. They're the leaders of society. And then you have it, it's a gradient. It goes down. And then you have reds, who are the smallest, 5 feet, 4 feet. And they're very weak. They're very wimpy. They have red hair, red eyes. And they end up being the miners, and they do a lot of that manual labor stuff. Another thing is how they kind of regulate this is that golds stay 9 months in the womb. All the other tiers, as it goes down, they spend less time in the womb. So that's why they're not fully developed to the extreme. So that's kind of the idea of how the caste system works. So you have the manual laborers and the miners, the lowest of the lows, and the golds, the rulers of society, thus the highest of the highest. And basically, that's kind of how you can just explain it. It's an action adventure story following our protagonist as he's a pioneer for humanity, and what that means for him and what that means for his family, and if that's all he'll ever be. Will he stay in this society, or will he evolve to more? Who knows? I don't. Just kidding, I do. But that's really all I can say about the story without spoiling it. I think that there's so much I want to say, but I really do want to limit the amount of spoilers I give so that there's the optimal experience, because there was so little I knew about this book before going in. I didn't even know it was science fiction. I thought it was a fantasy book. And I think that the lack of knowledge that I had really enhanced my experience. Like, I'm not someone who believes in anti-spoilers. Like, I'm not like, oh, a spoiler will ruin a movie or a series. But I know some people feel that way. So I'm not gonna do that, because I want them to have the optimal experience. I adore so many of the characters in this book, and their burdens felt like my own burdens, even though I've never been put in any of these situations. Their plights felt like my own. My heart wept when characters had to make tough decisions, because I felt like my friends, my people had to make those tough decisions. And throughout the story, repeatedly, my heart was torn to pieces because Pierce Brown likes hurting me. When my friends made factions and they divided amongst each other, and they weren't all friendly, because they can't all be friendly, because that's how it works, But I was like, ah! The ending is the most perfect ending for the story, and I couldn't have written a better ending for the book. However, I think it's the weakest ending out of the trilogy, and that says something. Pierce Brown knows his endings. And the ending is so satisfying that I technically would have been fine if this was just a standalone book and there was never a sequel. I think it would have obviously been left up open-ended, and personally, technically it doesn't finish the story. But it would have been a really good story, just standalone. But it didn't need to be a standalone, and it went on, and I liked the rest of them, so it's fine. I gave this book 4.75 stars, which means that this is technically, because of the roundup, the first 5-star book of the year. I don't really give 5 stars a lot. I don't really give masterpieces. But if any book was going to get it, this book does deserve it. Okay, Tactics by Gregory Kokel. This isn't really a Devo book, but it's more like a Christian, it's kind of a Devo. It's about basically evangelism, and it kind of gives some of the guides to how to incorporate evangelism naturally into conversation. Basically, the point is, it was a really helpful book. It was really good about how to kind of notice conversational cues and what to do, and how to really defend your faith, as well as to present arguments in a way that isn't very accusatory, and to really listen to other people. I really liked it. This book really felt tailor-made to someone who's lived my life experience, which sounds really dumb because I keep saying all these books are tailor-made to me. But there's so much of this book that is specifically made to reference Columbo, which is a murder mystery show from like the 80s or the 90s. I'm not 100% sure. Like, that is something that's super unique, you know? Like, that's not something that you see in a lot of stuff. Not a lot of people my age have seen the show or even heard of the show. But I know Columbo because I grew up watching so many murder mysteries with mom and dad, and they were like, oh, let's watch Columbo because Columbo's the one murder mystery show where they show you the crime at the beginning, and then you have to see how Columbo figures it out. And the whole way that Columbo figures it out is by playing dumb and asking the right questions and whatever. And that's literally what this book is about. It's about being like Columbo and asking leading questions to figure out stuff and catch people in their lies. And I was like, I know exactly what this is talking about. Overall, I really enjoyed reading this. It was, obviously, for a nonfiction book, it was really, really good. I gave it 4.5 stars. So, the next book that I read is the audiobook Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. It is the second book in the Red Rising trilogy. And so I'm not going to give a premise because, again, that spoils the conclusion of the first book. But this book is much more of a geopolitical space opera rather than like the first book. This book, I really enjoyed it. I think it's technically the fan favorite of the trilogy. I enjoyed the first book more personally, but I do understand why people loved it so much. There's one specific scene that I listened to right before my class, and then after my class, I rewound and listened to that scene again. Also, unfortunately, my heart was massacred during this book because my favorite character in the trilogy unfortunately meant an untimely demise, which some might argue was timely. I am not one of those some, but unfortunately, I'm not going to spoil who my favorite character is or what happened because duh. But no, I'm salty. Like, the thing is, I get it from a logical standpoint why it happened. I get it. But from an emotional standpoint, Pierce Brown, how could you do this to me? Like, how could you make this like beauty and then tear my heart out? Why? Anyway, I digress. That's my favorite character in the trilogy, but I will not be telling anyone my favorite character if they start it because I will not be spoiling this because I need to talk about the death more than I need to talk about the life. Okay. Also, I didn't plan on immediately starting the third book after I finished this book, but I didn't have a choice. Because remember how I talked about how Pierce Brown writes really good endings? Well, this is my favorite ending of the trilogy between the three books. When I finished it, I no longer had the option to wait to read book 3. It was now taken from me. And then I must continue the series. Otherwise, I would not be able to sleep at night. I gave this book 4.2 stars. There was a lot that I really liked about it, but I don't know. That's just the vibe. The next book was the third book in the Red Rising trilogy, Morning Star by Pierce Brown. Here's a couple tangents that don't really relate to this. Well, they relate to the story, but not in an obvious way. The Obsidian race is a mixture to me of the orcs from World of Warcraft and Vikings. That's just how I see them, and that's accurate. And trigger warning for anyone who's like me and disgustingly hates all mollusks. There's like a really gross man-eating snail. It doesn't really have a lot of screen time, but a man-eating snail that's the size of a dog, haunting. Nightmares. Ugh. I think this book had one of the most interesting representations I've ever seen of psychological torture on people and their actions. And I did enjoy that. I liked it. Which makes me sound insane. Well, too late now. So, this is kind of an out of context spoiler. There's a certain moment that I was waiting to happen the entire trilogy, that I was literally waiting for it to happen the entire time. That did happen. And when it happened, I started sobbing because I was so happy and so satisfied that it finally happened. And it was the perfect thing to happen. It was amazing. I think about it and I could cry right now. And if you know me, it's like super obvious what I'm talking about. Like, if you've read the books, of course, or like you've read at least like the first book. But I'm the winner because it happens. The overall ending to the trilogy was really strong, and the thing is, it felt like a lot more grounded in realism that you see from a lot of fantasy books, which fantasy, I would say sci-fi too, but I don't really know that many sci-fi books that I've read. But it felt a lot more grounded in realism than a lot of stories that I've seen, so I appreciated that. There is a sequel series, but I'm taking a break because first of all, my heart can't handle this much trauma. And the secondary reason is that it's not completed yet. I think it's going to be a 4-part book series. I'm not entirely sure. There's 3 books out right now, so I will eventually get to those. But I know that there's a 4th book coming out, so I know it's not complete yet. And considering the way Pierce Brown likes to end books, I can't physically withstand waiting from one book to another. So I'm just waiting till it's done. But I am excited to spend more time in this world. There's a lot of different avenues it can go. I'm not entirely sure about what happens. Like, I don't know what we're going to be following because obviously the series completed its story. So I'm just curious about that. We shall see. Overall, 4.25 stars. I think this book, I know this book was a bit slower than the other two, but I think that a lot of the conclusions and a lot of the answered questions in this book and a lot of individual scenes that happened at like the halfway point onward really made this book feel so worth it. Yeah. So the next book that I read when Percy came to visit me and we read it together. Very sweet. So the next book that I read was A Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Robertson. I really like the concept of this book. The world is really interesting and enchanting. And I really loved the magic system, the relationships between the grimoires, the sorcerers, the librarians, the ethereal combustion, the familiars, the glamour. And I know that a lot of those are referenced in other fantasy tropes and other fantasy genres. The grimoires was especially unique and I really enjoyed that touch. It's really funny that the familiars have a power called glamour. I think it's funny. I think it's funny in every single book that does it that the ability is called glamour. Genuinely hilarious. If I had to describe this book in a single sentence, it would be 2 orphans are on a magical adventure with their immortal nanny. That's not actually how the book is, but I just needed to say that. The premise of the book is that the main character, Elizabeth, is raised in a library, and normally people aren't really allowed into the library until they're like 13 years old. She's left there on the the door of a magical library when she's like a baby. So she's raised there in the library. And so she's super, super familiar with the books and she loves it. And basically the librarians, the people who live in the library, the wardens who live in the library have a very contemptuous relationship with the sorcerers because the sorcerers need the grimoires to perform their magic or to write it down or whatever. But the wardens have to try to limit people's contact with the grimoire so that like people aren't getting powerful, magic. So the story starts by the main character Elizabeth running into a sorcerer who's important. He's an arch something. I don't remember. Oh, whatever. The point is, she runs into the sorcerer and she kind of learns a little bit about ethereal combustion, which is basically this metallic smell that is the aftermath of magic being performed because there's this metallic scent. Anyway, so fast forward to the events of the future. Elizabeth's patron, the reason she's still allowed to stay in the library, is the... Okay, so Elizabeth is her patron. The reason she's allowed to stay in the library is, I forget the title, but it's the lady who's in charge of the library. And so Elizabeth wakes up randomly in the middle of the night. Everyone's still asleep. And she goes downstairs and she finds that this lady, the one who's in charge of the library, is dead. And she smells metal. So, magic killed her. And that's where the mystery starts. Ta-da! So that's the premise of the story. I felt like overall, this book, 2 things. Number 1, this book was marketed as enemies to lovers, which I didn't know until after I read the book. What a lie that would be. If I read this book thinking that was the case, I would have been like, no, it wasn't. But I know now after reading it, no, it wasn't. Second thing is, I felt that the romance was really cute, but it felt really quick. It felt very underdeveloped. There wasn't enough moments of yearning and building in that romantic tension over the relationship. And so it felt like not enough romantic tension happened before the relationship kind of got its ground footing. And that's really a shame because the story didn't need to end in the romance being where it was. It could have ended somewhere a little bit earlier romantically, the journey, but it is what it is. The thing is, I respect that the story is a fantasy story first with a romance second, and I really, really do respect that. I'm not saying the romance had to be the main focus. I'm saying that if you're gonna have a romance, write a romance well. But I did like the dynamic of the romance, like the dichotomy between Nathaniel and Elizabeth worked really well. I was vibing. Non-spoiler, spoiler. This book's climax felt really good in concept and rushed in execution. So here's a spoilery thing. So the ending. I like the ending because of course I like feeling good and having fun. And I love dopamine rushing to my brain and erasing all my logic and reasoning. But I think that the story felt, to some degree, lacking in consequence for a lot of the actions that happened. There's other instances of it, but one of which I would argue the ending does validate the lack of consequences. Silas is by far my favorite character. I don't know what that says about me, and I don't think it'd say anything good about me, but that's reality, and we live for truth here. Overall, I gave the book 3.75 stars. It was really enjoyable, but, you know, a little bit of editorial work would have done wonders. Okay, so remember how I said it was embarrassing that I started a book last summer and it took me this long to read it? Well, imagine starting a book when you're 13 years old and it takes until you're 24 to finish it. This is the most humiliating read of my life. It's so embarrassing it took this long. The thing is, I can tell you why, and it's because I started it when I was younger and I liked it, but the first 3 chapters are really slow, and it's like an extreme geopolitical like conflict going on. And as an adult, I thought it was a little slow, but it was interesting, but it was a little slow. But as a 13-year-old, I didn't care. I didn't want to care. And look how big this book is. Look at it. What? I didn't want to, I would start it, and then I would get bored, and then I'd forget everything, so then I'd restart it. And I did that a lot when I was younger, to this book specifically. This is the second book in the Lumateer Chronicles. I read the first one. I love the first one. The first one was one of my favorite books for a really long time. If not, still one of my favorite books. I like the first one better, but that's besides the point. But it took me so long to read it. And I know that it's because of the size, and I was scared. And to be honest, I'm kind of glad, based on some of the subject matters talked about in here, and especially because how geopolitical it is, that I didn't read it when I was 13. But here we are, and we're gonna talk about it. I really enjoyed, one aspect I really enjoyed about this book is that this book essentially takes place in 5 places. It's not an adventure story where you're moving around a lot. And so a lot of the mystery was about what was happening at those events, what was happening, what were the geopolitical stuff, what was the, what was going on. But also there's mystery in the events that are happening in the story, but there's also mystery in the background of the characters because everybody is the worst person you've ever met. And it's such a good story. That sounds so stupid, but nobody is inherently likable, and so they're all likable. Well, not exactly. But the point is that no one's really a good person. They're all so negatively impacted by the flaws that they have that it makes it so the story's so interesting because you're learning about these people and you're kind of humanizing them by learning why they're bad people. But they're not bad people where they're irredeemable. But they're also not good people. And it's so interesting. I've never read a book that nearly all of the cast is bad people. And I liked it. I liked it. Again, I don't know what that says about me, but here we are. Specifically though, the ending of this book had me gasping and crying. I literally was out of breath and I debated going for my inhaler. I kind of stopped functioning for longer than I would like to admit. And I immediately had to reread the ending to confirm if what I read was correct. And I remember, if I read it properly, because I was there's no way I read that properly. And I did, in fact. And I was just in awe and shock at the ending, which sounds stupid to be oh, Vanessa, you're in awe and shock of an ending of a book that's written for teenagers. Yeah, so my heart felt physical pain. And I felt so annoyed because I have the third book physically at my house. And guess where I'm not? At my house. So I was I have to wait to read the third book. And it was So, you know what we're doing when we get home. So yeah, the third book is waiting on my shelf at home, so far away from me. So far. And I'm just going to say it. Based on Froi of the Exiles and Red Rising, I'm concerned about the ability of certain authors, in this case, Melanie Marchetta and Pierce Brown, to make me like characters that I think commit deplorable actions. I'm able to be manipulated into loving characters that I find their past actions deplorable and reprehensible. And I would disavow them in real life. They just write characters good. Like, what can I say? I track with it. Like, it's good stuff. Anyway, I gave this book 4 stars. There were some topics that I felt, there are some parts of this book that weren't necessarily my favorite inherently, and obviously, again, I didn't explain the premise. Sequel book inherently gives away the ending. The next book that I read is The Power of Prayer and the Prayer of Power by Reuben A. Torrey. One fun fact before I ruin this book for you is that Reuben was married to a woman named Clara Smith, and I sent that fun fact to Tim before I started reading the book. Keep that in mind. This book is it's not a Devo. It feels like a self-help book, I guess. What would you call this? It's something. Anyway, the point is it's a book basically talking about prayer, as the title suggests. Basically, the author makes everything that he talks about him. He gives inflammatory and ridiculous biblical analysis. And lastly, his writing is really poor, so the prose does not hit. One of my favorite parts of the book was when he went on and on talking about how he was the perfect parent and how his kids have never had any problems. So relatable, so grounded in reality. Oh, I feel it. Some quotes I especially loved was, I would rather see my daughter in a coffin than on the stage. Another good one is, if any of you parents have a pack of cards at home, I advise you to burn it up as soon as you get home. We love to see legalism here. Genuinely. Oh, you're an actor? Can't be Christian. You have cards? Who said Christians could have hobbies? Apparently not Reuben A. Torrey, man who thinks he can rewrite the Bible. 1 star. It gets that 1 star for making me laugh. So the next book that I read is The Devil in the White City, which is ironically the audiobook that I've wanted to read for the longest time. And you may be like, well then Vanessa, why did it take you this long when you started reading audiobooks? Who knows? So this book is nonfiction, and it is a story telling the parallel lives of Burnham and Holmes, both of which are 2 men that lived in Chicago, and both of them who have blue eyes. And this is in like the 1880s, I want to say, 1800s, not 100% sure. And so the idea is Burnham is the man who's responsible for building the Chicago World Fair, and Holmes is the first ever serial killer in America. One thing that really surprised me when reading this book is because I didn't know that the story was going to be written the way it was. I thought it was going to be more fictionalized. I was expecting the serial killings to happen at the World Fair. They kind of did, but they also kind of didn't. But whatever. We appreciate realism. I didn't expect to find the architecture more interesting than the serial killings, surprisingly, considering me. I learned so much, architectural fun facts that, I find fascinating. And, learning about the Chicago World Fair, super cool. Loved that. Genuinely loved that. I learned a ton of history and civil engineering, and, I know nothing about civil engineering, so I really appreciated that, genuinely. Learning the first skyscraper was made in Chicago, and, learning how they built, the skyscrapers and, buildings that were that tall in Chicago, considering it was, marshlands and, it was, muddy and, they couldn't dig deep enough for the foundations, and that's how they had to build the structures of, that was so cool. Also, my favorite character in the book died pretty early on, which was extra depressing because he's a real guy. And when I told both Mom and Ari that, they're like, oh, did the serial killer get him? And I said, no, he died of pneumonia. And that ended up being really funny because at the end of the book, they mentioned that, because Burnham, the guy who built the World Chicago Fair, had a partner, and his partner's name was Root. Root was who my favorite character was. And so apparently, because Root died tragically during the building of the World Fair, a lot of women really liked him, and they gave him a lot of credit for the building of the World Fair, and they overinflated his importance in the project, which is funny because that's something apparently a bunch of young women did. And as a younger woman myself, I read the book and I was like, oh, that's my favorite character. And I I overly inflated him as well to the importance of the story. The irony is there. That's so funny. That was amusing. Anyway, I give the story a 3.5. I think it was a really interesting way of telling history, and I really enjoyed it, but a lot of it felt very exposition-y and felt like it could have been cut a little bit, but I did appreciate the documentariness of it. Okay, so Mysteries of Thorn Manor is the sequel novella to The Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. One thing that just really bothered me personally is that the narrator is the same, but enough time had passed that she forgot how she narrated the voices in the first book. And so the only character that sounds the same is Elizabeth, and everyone else's voice is different. And like that made it really hard for me to kind of like know who was talking when stuff happened. That wasn't very fun. I'm also never going to get over the fact that Elizabeth's sword in this universe is called Demon Slayer. And I understand, like, logically, that's a conclusional name for a sword. It's just, Kimitsu no Yaiba. I don't have a ton of experience with it, but this feels like a fan fiction written about the first story, not a sequel to the story. It feels like equivalent to the sequel epilogues on Webtoon. That is not a compliment. I hate them with all of my passion. The next comment is a spoiler, so I'm going to say without any context, so you only understand it if you've read it. Okay? Okay. 30 years to 2 days. I just need to say it. Someone had to. One thing I will say about this book and the previous book is that I really like the way that magic interacts with the nightmares of this in this world, and how the nightmares become real and different depending on which nightmare it is, and the magic kind of makes them real. I really enjoyed that. It's beautifully chilling. I feel like this book is like made to make up for their missing romantic developments, the depth of some of the characters, the trauma, and just like some of the complexities of the relationships in the first book. But these things should have happened long before the epilogue, especially like before the couple got together. Like, these things should have happened before the couple got together so that there was tension and the romance was better. Ugh. Last comment. If a man ever said, "That's my girl" to me,
that's my girl,
I think I'd gag on the spot. I just, no. 2.5 stars. Hello! The next book that I read is The Turn of the Century, which is the second book in the Coming Dawn trilogy. Due to the inherent nature of sequels, I cannot give a premise for this book. However, the first scene in the book feels like something out of a nature documentary. I think that's hilarious. I'm saying it. The problem for me with this book is that some of the characters that I didn't really understand or really connect with in the first book, or I struggled with them just in general. They're either their importance in the story or their existence. I didn't really feel like this book really resolved any of those issues as to why these characters should be there or why I should like them, which was, a little bit of a shame. But the characters I did like more, including Drazdan, Zev, Cyrus, and Xeris. I like all of them. Respect it. Random side note, Adolin just reminds me of Aizen from Bleach. So, out of context, comment spoiler. I was not vibing with the ghosts of Christmas past. That being said, I really did like a lot of the battle sequences that were in this book. 2 in particular of the battle sequences I found really intriguing, or I guess more, not necessarily battle sequences, action sequences. 2 I found really well written. And then 1 high tension race. Those scenes really held all the climactic weight of the book. And so it was kind of like the book was a little more chill, and then those scenes are like the big moments. To be fair, the book was a lot shorter than the previous one. I think this book was 6 hours and the first one was 10, which limited the pace and the amount of events that could occur. But if I had one criticism, really just kind of overarchingly explain my thoughts, it's that since the book was so short, the direction of the book should have been implemented earlier in the novel. So that the story felt like there was more of a purpose throughout it. Or the second half of the story should have been beefed up, maybe kind of fluffed up so there was a little bit more events, so it felt like maybe the first third rather than first half. I gave it 3.25 stars. It was fine. The next book that I have is The Agents of the Four Seasons, specifically The Dance of Spring. Look at it. Wait, let it load. Yeah. The cover is so beautiful and ethereal. Like, look. Oh, and then do not forget the chibis on the back. So this book is based on the idea that there are 4 tribes in Japan that represent the 4 seasons. And basically, a person from each clan is chosen to be the incarnate power of each season. And so they are responsible for the turn of the seasons. I don't necessarily know if it's the turn of the seasons in all of Japan or in all of the world. It doesn't really matter, because this world is only in Japan, as far as I know. Other countries don't exist. Maybe the other countries have their own seasons, but this one we're just assuming just Japan. And so they all have the incarnate powers of their specific season. The story has a lot of mystery to it, so I'm going to keep it vague with some of the description of the plot. But basically the premise is that there's all these 4 seasons, right? They're all incarnated in these people. And for whatever reason, Hinagiku, our protagonist, has not been able to make spring for the past 10 years. And so this story's a mystery, and it kind of explores as to why her as a character hasn't really done it, or maybe the circumstances surrounding it. I don't really want to spoil it. This is really cute. I enjoyed. This book really captured characters and their relationships really well, and like the complexities of it, and they're really interesting. Monologues. All the characters have extremely unique motivations. They don't feel like tropes. It's very anti-anime in the fact that no one feels like a stereotype personality trope, which is really interesting because normally in anime, characters start off kind of baseline like tropey, and then they develop more. This one, they don't feel like tropes at all, actually, which is nice. I wouldn't necessarily say that this book has a lot of plot elements happening in the story. Obviously, there is like a plot and there is stuff going on and happening, but a lot more of the story is based on the relational events that are occurring. And I would say this book is a lot more of a precursor to events happening than the events themselves. Like, this book it's a little bit slower in nature, and it feels more like it's the prelude of getting to know the characters in the world and their interconnected relationships and complexities prior to the main event, because the book ends on something that is 100% going to lead to chaos. So the book is really leading to this moment, and you're kind of building into there, and like it's like building but like softly. Even though the romance was really non-existent between these two, between Rose and Hinagiku, their romance is really, really cute and really, really wholesome, and it's like, I ship it. But I really like Rose and Hinagiku a lot, and I really like their dynamic and their ship and their complexity and their trauma. Oh, their relationship is just really wholesome, and the foundation it's built on, but the foundation that it's being rebuilt upon is just so good. Oh, it's good stuff. On the more emotional side of me as a person, I just want all of these kids to be happy and not have trauma, and just to be able to live their lives with their superhero powers and not have to worry about a thing in the world. But on the story side, I'm really interested in what's going to happen. But I just want them to be happy, and they're not happy, and it makes me sad. I have a strong desire to read the sequel, which I know came out, but I haven't gotten it yet. But I am hooked. 4 stars. So the next book that I read was Rejection Proof by Jia Jiang. This book was a gift. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see things, I didn't read it until now. Even though I received it over a year ago. But we know this. We know that I get books and they're just in physical or digital TBR for forever, as every reader can attest. So the book's premise is that this is a nonfiction book. It's not Christian. It's written by a Mormon author. He's a Mormon Chinese immigrant into America, and this is his journey to basically get over the fear of rejection. So how he decides to do this is he creates this self-inflicted challenge called the 100 Days of Rejection, where basically every day he does something or asks something kind of ridiculous so that hopefully someone will reject him. If people don't reject him, he gets to live a really interesting experience. And if they do, then he learns from it and gets more okay of rejection. So like, for example, he got to like say hello to everyone on a flight by asking a flight attendant if he could give these safety announcements. And they said, no, you can't, but you can say hi to everyone and introduce yourself. And he said, sure. So things like that. I don't like self-help books, even though this was given to me at a time in my life where rejection was a very prevalent aspect. So I understand the idea of why this was given to me. But a lot of self-help books just feel really pretentious, like they're coming from a place of arrogance, and they usually are. Like, this one is too, and one of the main problems I had with the author is that he didn't really struggle with rejection necessarily. He struggled with the idea of being rejected. So basically he's just worried about what rejection would be, not that he got rejected. So like he's married, he has a really stable job, and he makes a lot of money at his job. He never got rejected from any of the schools that he applied to. And so like maybe he got rejected by like someone telling him an idea that he had was stupid or whatever, but he didn't get rejected in any meaningful way that was like really life altering. And considering I've been rejected in meaningful ways that were really life altering, it just felt like this dude who really had it pretty easy was telling me to get over it. Wasn't a big fan. And so basically it's just all about his baseless fear of rejection, which rejection, being afraid of it, isn't baseless, but like for him, considering he's gotten everything kind of handed on a silver spoon, was a bit baseless. The only thing I really found of value in this book was talking about the difference between failure and rejection, which was nice. I appreciated that. Like there was a specific chapter where he was talking about like specific authors and how many times their books got rejected before they got published and yada yada and whatever. And I think like the understanding the difference between rejection and failure is totally fair, and that's something that's really hard for people to distinguish, myself included. But it's the only thing I found in this book. I really struggled with how to rate this book because I think it's not really offensive. Like it doesn't say anything that's like inherently offensive like The Power of Prayer did and whatnot. So I thought might as well give it like 2.5 stars because it's fine, it's average. Or no, it's average. When I was reading this book, I never wanted to pick it up. And when I picked it up, I wanted to put it down. I actively never wanted to read it, even though it's really short. So I settled on giving it 2 stars. So the next book that I read was 1984 by George Orwell. So I really wanted to read this book because it's a classic that everyone reads in school, but I was never assigned to read in school. So I was like, I'm going to give that to me as a homework assignment. The premise of the book, in case you haven't read it, we may or may not live in the year 1984, and the protagonist, Winston Smith, is committing a thought crime against the thought police and Big Brother by writing in a journal that he purchased hidden from the telescreen. The story follows Winston from here. He elaborates on the complexity of Oceania and Big Brother and the society that they live in. He elaborates on his day-to-day life, working at the Ministry of Truth. And he explains what he thinks is going on and what he thinks is under the veil. And that's kind of the premise of the book without spoiling the plot. The book is a little slow at parts. I say that the book's kind of split into thirds. The first third is a lot more setup. The second third is, I think, supposed to be more characterization. I found it the most boring. The third part is a lot of the payoff of the rest of the book. But even though the first 2 parts could be considered more slow, it's all for really building the tension of the book to really build the stakes for the payoff that happens in Act 3. And I really, really think it works. It's all for that world building. I also think there's a very definitive reason this book is called a classic, and I was explaining it to Mom before I finished it that I knew what the ending was going to be because this book's a classic, and that there's only one way for this book to end for it to be considered a classic, and I was right. Some quotes I especially loved, but out of context, were, "History has stopped all that exists is an endless present, and to die hating them is freedom." So I rated this book 3.75 stars. I enjoyed it. Genuinely. It's a good book. Who's asleep amidst the trees? The next book is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed. I really adore the gothic nature of this book and how it handles the darker themes with such subtlety and depth and nuance. So, the premise of this book is that Effie Sayre is the only girl at the architecture college in her university. She really wanted to be inside the literature college, but unfortunately, they don't allow girls. And Effie has this codependency on this specific author named Middleton, and he is known for writing stories based on the southern folk tales because he's from the south and she's a northern girl. So a lot of people think it's a little bit silly for her to be so interested in this southern storyteller. But he's well-renowned academically as well as renowned throughout their country of Lyria. And so she's specifically enamored with Midodin, and more specifically enamored with his work Angharad. And Angharad is a story that is told within the story of A Study of Drowning, and it follows the protagonist, Angharad, being abducted and married to the fairy king. And it's very important for the story, but it's a story within a story, which I think is a super cool conception. When the opportunity arises for Effie to participate in a competition to take over as the architect to design Midodin's estate now that he's recently passed, she jumps at the opportunity to participate, and she can't enter quickly enough into the competition. Even though she's not a good architect student at all, she wants to just take this experience, and the story follows her as she learns more about Midodin and the world around her and the world around him, and things that she just overall didn't know about her beloved author. And it's a super interesting story. One thing to note before we kind of go into some of my other thoughts, the prose in this book stole my heart. Every single chapter starts with a line from a piece of literature in this fictional world, whether that's from Angharad, which is written by Midodin, or whether it's by some like commentary written by some other people about fictional works. In this work, it's just like, the prose and like that little setup of world building, so good. Speaking of the prose being immaculate, the line, "I will love you to ruination," is one of the most fantastic lines I've ever read, and I will never forget it. It's just like, it's so good because it comes from that story from the story. That's the line that the fairy king says to Angharad. And so her response is, "Yours or mine?" Bars! I think it was such a clever line, and it really just showed so much nuance in the story and their relationship. However, I do think that the author knew that it was super clever, and she mentioned it a little bit too much. She reset it a lot, but like, it was just a little too much. Like, she could have been a little less heavy-handed with the salt, but it was good. She deserved it, but a little less seasoning. Let it speak for itself. Let it simmer. The romance between the two protagonists, was so real and refreshing, and it didn't feel like the super tropey things that you see all the time, and I was just like, yes, this is good. Like, Preston is such a good guy, and he's so detached from the typical love interest in like romance stories, and like liking Preston and seeing that he's a good guy makes me have hope for my future, because I'm like, oh, I can see the green flags. I got worried. There were several moments throughout the story, not just at the ending, but like throughout the story, that were so tense that they actually had me in a chokehold, and I was really struggling to breathe. And Mom's like, "Put down the book, like, stop listening to it, use your inhaler." And I was like, "But I can't, I need to know." But yeah, I really could barely breathe at certain points. Most of my complaints come from this book are about the ending, I would say. I think the ending was good and conclusive, but certain choices about the ending made the narrative seem too clean. It took out a little bit of the nuance and the interest and the interesting elements that had been previously established. Like, it felt too clean and polished in this story where everything up until this point had been a myriad of gray. I think that if the ending had been adjusted, like I know exactly the two things I would change about the ending to fix it. And if those two things had happened, I would easily have been able to give this book 4.5 or 5 stars. Easily. 4.5 or higher. If the ending had just been slightly adjusted in those two ways. But unfortunately, it wasn't, so I have to give it a little bit lower of a rating. But the vibes throughout the rest of the book were so good, and just overall the story was so good up until that point. So I gave it 4 stars anyway. Okay, so our next book is the Audible original dramatized version of 1984 by George Orwell. Imagine reading a book twice, back to back. This isn't the book I would have picked to read twice out of all the books that I've read. The reason I read this one is because I specifically knew it was a dramatized version, and I thought that this would be something like, because I wanted to recommend 1984 to Tim, and so I thought maybe the dramatized version will be really good. And I can recommend it, and it's like less the time. It's like 3.5 hours instead of like 11 hours. So I was like, oh, maybe it'll be like a good version for him to read. And so I was like, it's also not that big commitment for me. Well, to be honest, Andrew Garfield, who plays Winston Smith, does a lot better at playing Winston than I would have expected him to. So good on you, Andrew Garfield. You can indeed act. And this really is an abridged version of the story. Like, I just really need to emphasize that. Like, there's so much of the story that's really cut out to make it so it's kind of like key moments, but not really the story. And so I just read 1984. And I was confused at certain points in this version because I was like, what's happening? I just read the book. Andrew Scott definitely does the best out of any of the other actors. His performance as O'Brien is so spectacular. I wish the audiobook was longer so we could have had more scenes of him just talking as O'Brien, because he does significantly better as O'Brien than the other voice actor in the previous version I read. But I really wish we could have had an unabridged version of him as the voice actor of O'Brien, because he does so good. And I was so surprised because, like, I didn't know Andrew Scott by name, but I know who he is. I was like, I didn't know that you had this in you, but it also makes sense. But it's like, he did a really good job as O'Brien. It really did. It really was the highlight of the reading experience. I wish I could have read him act more. Overall, it was a really cool idea, but it wasn't particularly my vibe. I didn't really like it. I understand a lot of people did like it. If you like the story and you just kind of want like a highlights reel version, that's what this feels like, but like it's 3 hours. It probably is better at telling the story than a movie would be. Maybe, but I don't know. Nearly all of the tension and depth was lost from the book and like the story in general. I think that nothing really mattered, and like they kept on making callbacks to things that they never really paid off because they were just picking parts of the book and they weren't really changing it, but they didn't really pay it off well. Overall, 2.5 stars. It is what it is. So overall, not as many books read as I was planning. I have a lot of books that I still want to read audiobook wise. There's other books that I've started that I haven't gotten a chance to read, but I think overall it's a pretty good haul. And I think we have a total of 24 books that I read in about 4 months. So I was happy with it, but it could have been better. But at the end of the day, hopefully you found some of these interesting. Hopefully my rambling was to some degree entertaining. Thanks for watching.